Las Vegas, summer of 1972. The showroom at the Hilton trembles under the roar of thousands. Spotlights slash through the haze of cigarette smoke, rhinestones glitter, and the king stands center stage, larger than life, triumphant after his legendary comeback. The orchestra swells, fans scream his name, and every flashbulb tries to capture a piece of him. And then it happens. Across the ocean of faces, Elvis sees her. A woman sitting in the first row, still as stone, her eyes fixed on him with a calm intensity that drowns out the chaos around her. He hasn't seen that face in nearly 20 years, yet it pierces through the blinding lights as if no time has passed at all. She isn't just another admirer. She is the first, the only beloved who ever saw him before the crown, before the legend, before the world claimed him. The girl from Memphis, who once slipped out of his life when fame began to swallow him whole. Now, against the backdrop of glittering gowns, roaring voices, and the fever of Las Vegas, it feels as though the entire crowd has vanished. Every word of the song pouring from his mouth, a song never meant for her, bends, reshapes, transforms into a message only she can hear. The king sings for thousands, but tonight the stage is a battlefield of two, and every note is a question he never thought he would have to ask again. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. Memphis in the early 1950s was a city where sweat clung to every brick wall, where the Mississippi heat pressed down like an iron lid, and where music slipped through the cracks of poverty like a secret language. The streets smelled of fried catfish, oil from garage shops, and dust kicked up by buses that carried workers to factories before sunrise. Houses sagged under peeling paint, porches leaned, and children played barefoot on cracked sidewalks. In the midst of this landscape lived a boy who still blended into the ordinary. Elvis Aaron Presley. He was tall but carried himself with the awkwardness of someone not yet sure of his place in the world. His hair was longer than what most local boys wore, slicked back with cheap Vaseline he bought at the corner store. His clothes were hand-me-downs or stitched by his mother, often just a little too big. To neighbors, he was just that polite Presley boy who worked odd jobs and kept to himself, humming tunes when he thought no one was listening. But inside him was a restlessness, a quiet fire that no one could see. That fire often carried him across town to a modest building on Union Avenue, Sun Records. The place wasn't glamorous. Its walls were thin, its floors scuffed, its equipment second-hand. Yet for Elvis, stepping into that studio was like walking into church. It was where he could lose himself in the rhythm and blues records he worshipped, the voices of black singers who poured pain and salvation into every note. It was during those restless evenings that he first noticed her. Her name was Clara Whitmore, though in his memory she would always remain simply Clara. She lived just a few blocks from the Presley home, daughter of a factory machinist and a mother who worked long hours at a diner. Clara had sharp, curious eyes, the kind that seemed to strip away pretenses. She wasn't one of the giggling girls who followed Elvis after church services. She wasn't interested in the boys who tried too hard. She watched the world with a kind of wary intelligence, as if she already understood how fragile dreams could be. The first time they spoke was on a humid afternoon outside a corner store. Elvis had been carrying a battered guitar case, its surface scratched and faded from too many bus rides. Clara, standing in line with a bag of groceries, tilted her head at him. "You play that thing?" she asked. "Or just carry it around so people think you do?" Her tone was teasing, but not cruel. Elvis blushed, shifting on his feet. "I play," he said softly. "Not very well, but I play." She smiled, and that was the beginning. Their friendship was simple at first. Walking home from church meetings, sharing sodas at the corner drugstore, evenings where he'd strum clumsy chords and she'd laugh when he forgot the words. Around Clara, Elvis didn't have to be the boy with ambitions too big for his neighborhood. He could be just himself, awkward and hopeful. But even in those early days, there were shadows. Clara's father had no patience for that Presley boy. To him, Elvis was trouble wrapped in a guitar case. A working man who put in 12 hours at the factory had little respect for music that came from black neighborhoods. Music his daughter seemed too curious about. "That's not real work," he told her, slamming his hand on the dinner table. "That boy's chasing after foolishness." Clara never argued back, but Elvis could feel the tension. When he walked her home, she'd hesitate before the porch, her father's silhouette visible through the curtains. She'd whisper quick good nights, almost as if afraid the walls themselves would scold her. Still, she kept coming back. Elvis was poor, and he knew it. His shoes were worn thin, his family moved from one shabby apartment to another, and his mother often cried over bills. But with Clara, none of that seemed to matter. She liked the way he listened, the way he didn't talk over her, the way he seemed to carry an invisible burden, yet never complained. By late 1954, change was stirring. Sun Records gave him a chance to record. "That's all right," crackled through the radio waves, and suddenly the Presley boy wasn't invisible anymore. Girls squealed. Boys mocked his style but couldn't ignore him. Clara listened to the song in her kitchen, the sound filling the room with something both familiar and foreign. She smiled, but behind her smile was unease. Fame didn't arrive overnight, but its scent lingered in the air. Elvis began traveling more, playing shows across the South, sometimes gone for weeks. When he returned, he carried himself differently. He was still shy, but there was a weight to him now, an awareness that eyes followed wherever he went. Clara tried to pretend nothing had changed. They still walked, still talked. But late at night she admitted to herself that the boy who once blushed at her jokes was slowly being replaced by someone else. Someone the world wanted to claim. The breaking point came in 1955. Elvis had signed with Colonel Parker, and tours stretched farther and longer. The pressure of crowds, the flashing cameras, the endless miles on buses, all of it carved him into a figure larger than the boy Clara had known. She came to one of his shows in Memphis, standing in the back of the hall. The screams of girls around her drowned out the music, but she didn't need to hear every note. She only watched him. The way he moved, the way the spotlight clung to him. He wasn't hers anymore, and perhaps he never truly had been. When the show ended, she didn't wait by the stage door like the others. She walked home quietly, her hands trembling, her heart heavy with a truth she could not escape. She was in love with a boy who no longer existed. By autumn, their meetings grew rare. Letters went unanswered, phone calls grew shorter. She told him one night that she couldn't live in the shadow of the road, of fans, of the Colonel's relentless machine. He said nothing at first, only stared at his shoes. Finally, he whispered, "I'll always be just a boy from Memphis, Clara." But she shook her head. "Not anymore, Elvis. You belong to them now." And so it ended. Not with a storm of words, but with a quiet retreat. The last time he saw her was one cold night in late 1955. He was on a bus, leaving Memphis for another string of shows. The city slid past the window in a blur of street lamps and neon signs. Then, suddenly, there she was, standing on the corner in her coat, a grocery bag in her arms. She hadn't come to see him off. She was just there, living her ordinary life. But when their eyes met through the glass, time froze. Elvis pressed his forehead to the window. Clara didn't wave. She only held his gaze for a moment, then turned and walked away. As the bus rumbled into the night, Elvis felt something tear inside him. The applause he was chasing, the dreams he was running toward, none of it softened the ache of that sight. In the darkness of the bus, with other band members laughing and smoking, Elvis sat in silence, watching the city disappear behind him. Somewhere in the shadows of Memphis, he had left behind the one person who had known him before the world demanded he be anything more than a boy with a guitar. It was a wound that would never fully close. By 1956, the United States knew his name. Elvis Presley's face appeared in newspapers, on billboards, flickering across black and white television screens in living rooms from Texas to New York. He had gone from being a shy Memphis boy with a second-hand guitar to a symbol of something larger than himself. Rebellion, youth, and a sound that terrified the old and electrified the young. The first time he walked onto the stage of The Ed Sullivan Show, the audience screamed so loud that he could barely hear the opening notes. Flashbulbs popped like fireworks. The air was charged, as though history itself were tilting forward. He smiled nervously, but inside he felt split. One part still the boy who had once strummed quiet chords for Clara on a porch in Memphis. The other part, a figure carried on a tidal wave of fame he no longer controlled. Everywhere he went, people reached for him. Girls clawed at his jackets, tore buttons as souvenirs, screamed until they fainted. Hotel lobbies overflowed with fans, and policemen formed human walls to push him through. For most young men, it might have felt like triumph. For Elvis, it was often suffocating. Late at night, alone in hotel rooms, he sometimes caught himself thinking of eyes he hadn't seen in years. Clara's eyes. Not because he thought of her constantly. The speed of his new life left little room for quiet reflection. But because she would rise in his mind at the oddest, most fragile moments. In Texas one evening, he was halfway through Heartbreak Hotel, when a girl in the crowd tilted her head just so, her hair falling across her cheek in a familiar way. For a split second, he stumbled, forgetting a line. The band carried him forward. The audience never noticed, but inside he felt the jolt. After the show, when the dressing room filled with noise, he sat silently, hands pressed against his knees, fighting the memory of a corner in Memphis, where a girl once smiled at him as though he was nobody special. In 1958, the Army drafted him. His world shifted overnight. Gone were the lights and microphones, replaced by mud, drills, and the rigid rhythm of military life. He served in Germany, sleeping in barracks with men who barely cared who he was, scrubbing floors, shouldering rifles. On the surface, it was a relief to be treated like an ordinary soldier. Yet when mail arrived, he caught himself waiting for something that never came. Letters from fans poured in, but none carried her handwriting. Still, every time he opened one, there was a flicker of absurd hope, the kind that made him angry at himself afterward. Germany had its distractions. Music played on jukeboxes in local taverns, a handful of romantic encounters, nights where he laughed with fellow soldiers. But he kept a small box tucked in his trunk, photographs of family, of old friends, of Memphis streets. Among them, almost hidden, was a creased snapshot of Clara. He had kept it without ever admitting to himself why. On long nights, when the barracks fell quiet and the smell of cigarette smoke lingered, he'd take it out, trace the lines of her face with his eyes, then tuck it away again before anyone could notice. When he returned from the Army in 1960, America greeted him like a conquering hero. Crowds screamed at airports. Hollywood opened its doors. Movie sets became his new battlefield. Bright lights, cameras, endless retakes. The films were profitable, but to him they felt like golden cages. He sang scripted songs, acted in forgettable roles, smiled on command. The world saw success. Elvis felt something else, an emptiness, as though the real music inside him was being smothered under sequins and contracts. It was during these years, in the middle of glamorous parties and carefully staged photo shoots, that the memory of Clara cut the deepest. Not because he longed to run back, too much time had passed for such fantasies, but because she symbolized something he had lost. The boy who once sang without expectation, who believed music was just a voice in the dark, not a business. One evening in Los Angeles, after a long day of filming, he sat alone in his dressing room. The walls were covered with glossy posters of himself, smiling, frozen, unreal. On the counter lay a magazine with a photograph of him in uniform, saluting. As he flipped absent-mindedly through the pages, a small photograph slipped from the box he carried with him from place to place. It was her again. Clara, laughing, her hair tied back, eyes squinting in the Memphis sun. The photo had no reason to still exist, yet there it was, worn soft at the edges from years of handling. Elvis froze, the noise of the studio fading to silence around him. He stared at the photograph until his chest tightened. He tucked it quickly into his wallet, as though ashamed to be caught by his own memory. To the world, he was dazzling. A young man who had conquered the stage, survived the army, and become a movie star. But inside, he carried an unspoken truth, that some pieces of his life had slipped away so quietly they left scars deeper than fame could ever heal. The cheers, the flashing cameras, the money, the women. None of it erased the sense that he had left a part of himself on a Memphis street corner years ago. And no matter how high he climbed, he could never quite reach back to retrieve it. It was the paradox that would follow him for the rest of his life. Adored by millions, yet haunted by the memory of being seen once by just one person. Not as Elvis the King, but simply as Elvis, the boy. By 1972, Las Vegas had become a city that never slept. A restless carnival of neon, dice, cigarette smoke, and endless nights. On the Strip, the Hilton loomed like a monument to excess, its glowing sign promising entertainment of mythic proportions. Inside its massive showroom, waiters hurried through aisles balancing trays of cocktails, the air dense with perfume and cigar smoke. Tourists in glittering dresses and tuxedos leaned forward in anticipation. The king was about to appear. For Elvis, these performances were not just concerts, they were battles. He had something to prove. To the critics who claimed his career had peaked, to the skeptics who thought rock and roll belonged to the past, even to himself. After the triumph at Madison Square Garden, Vegas was his proving ground, the place where every note carried the weight of redemption. The lights dimmed, the orchestra struck its first explosive chords, and then he appeared. Dressed in a white jumpsuit studded with rhinestones, cape glittering under spotlights, he strode across the stage with the confidence of a man who knew thousands of eyes belonged to him alone. The crowd roared. Women reached out their hands. Men shouted approval. Flashbulbs flared. At first, it was routine. The opening numbers delivered with practiced fire, the rhythm pulsing through the packed room. Elvis worked the stage like a prizefighter, hips snapping, voice rich and commanding. Yet somewhere between the energy of Proud Mary and the aching tenderness of You Don't Have to Say You Love Me, his gaze caught on something unexpected. A face, Not just any face, but one he knew instantly, though it had been nearly 2 decades. Clara. She wasn't the girl from the Memphis sidewalks anymore. Her hair, once tied back with careless ribbons, now framed her face in mature waves streaked lightly with gray. Lines traced the corners of her eyes, but the eyes themselves, sharp, searching, impossible to mistake, were the same. She sat not in the frenzy of the front row, but a few seats back, her posture upright, her expression unreadable. For an instant, Elvis faltered. The band played on, the audience swayed, but he felt the floor tilt beneath him. Memories pressed in like ghosts, soda fountains, whispered talks under Memphis porches, the last glance through a bus window. He forced himself back into rhythm, but his heart pounded louder than the drums. When the set reached "Always on My Mind," the room shifted. The song had been new to his repertoire, chosen because it fit the arc of longing and regret he often threaded into his shows. But tonight, as he sang the opening line, the words burned differently. He looked toward her, and though thousands sat between them, it felt as though the hall collapsed into a single private space. You were always on my mind. The lyrics weren't just performance anymore. They were confession. His voice quivered with an edge he hadn't planned. The orchestra softened instinctively, following his mood. Some audience members leaned forward, puzzled at the sudden gravity, sensing something unscripted. A few whispered. The television cameras, set up to capture the concert, swept across the audience and paused for a heartbeat on Clara's face. The director, not knowing who she was, lingered just long enough for her expression, caught between restraint and raw emotion, to flicker onto the giant screens. The crowd murmured. Was this a fan? A muse? No one knew, but the tension in the room thickened. Elvis pressed harder into the song, each note sharper, more vulnerable. By the final verse, the applause was thunderous, but his eyes remained locked in that single direction. Backstage after the show, the usual chaos swirled. Security guards fought to control fans clamoring for autographs. Journalists shouted questions. Colonel Parker barked orders about the next engagement. Yet Elvis seemed detached, his thoughts elsewhere. He pulled aside one of his guards, a trusted member of the Memphis Mafia. "See the woman," he murmured. "Third row back, blue dress. Bring her in." The guard hesitated. Hundreds of women could be described that way, but Elvis's tone allowed no confusion. This wasn't a casual whim. Minutes later, as the crowd thinned and the backstage corridors buzzed with handlers and musicians, she appeared. Clara. She stepped cautiously, eyes wary, posture stiff against the backdrop of men in jumpsuits and women in sequins. For the first time in nearly 20 years, they stood within reach of each other. The noise around them dimmed. Elvis's entourage, sensing something unusual, stepped back, leaving a bubble of silence in the narrow hallway. Neither spoke at first. He studied her face, the changes time had carved, and the traces of the girl still shining through. She looked at him not with the awe of fans, but with the steady gaze of someone who had known him before he was anything but ordinary. "I came to hear the music," she said finally, her voice low, controlled. "Not the man." Her words struck harder than any headline ever had. Elvis nodded slowly, unable to summon the easy charm he used with strangers. For once, the performer had nothing rehearsed to offer. Clara's eyes softened, just slightly. "You still sing like you mean it." Behind them, the bustle of Vegas life pressed on. The shuffle of cards in casinos, the endless buzz of neon, the sound of coins spilling from slot machines. But for Elvis, the world had narrowed to this single, impossible moment. The return of someone he thought lost forever. The backstage corridors of the Hilton pulsed with energy. Musicians carried instrument cases, stagehands wheeled heavy equipment, and waitresses darted past with trays for the private lounges. The sharp tang of sweat mixed with perfume and cigarette smoke. Elvis's entourage, the so-called Memphis Mafia, clustered near the dressing rooms, joking, keeping watch, making sure fans didn't slip past security. But when she walked in, everything shifted. Clara's presence didn't fit the frenzy of Vegas nightlife. She wore a simple blue dress, elegant but understated, the kind of clothing that seemed almost out of place against the glitter of sequins and rhinestones around her. Her steps were measured, as though she wasn't sure if she belonged here, and her eyes searched the hallway with quiet defiance. Elvis stood at the far end, his cape draped over one arm, sweat still glistening at his temples. For a man used to commanding entire stadiums, he suddenly felt uncertain, like the shy boy who once stammered on Memphis sidewalks. "Let her through," he told his guards, his voice softer than they were used to. The men exchanged puzzled glances, but obeyed. When Clara stopped a few feet away, silence hung heavy. Around them, the noise of the post-show chaos receded as though the air itself understood the gravity of the moment. "It's been a long time," Elvis finally said, his words quiet, stripped of the smoothness that usually charmed strangers. Clara studied him. The man before her was both familiar and unrecognizable. The same face, yes, but etched with lines of exhaustion, eyes carrying shadows fame could never disguise. She folded her hands together. "I didn't come here for you," she said calmly. "I came for the music. That's all." The words hit like a blunt instrument. Elvis swallowed, nodding slightly, unsure whether to smile or flinch. He had spent years mastering every expression for cameras, every line for interviews, but nothing prepared him for her refusal to play along with the myth. "I could tell," he admitted, "the way you looked at me. Not like they do." He gestured vaguely toward the curtain, beyond which the crowd still lingered. "You looked like you were waiting for the song, not the man." For a moment, her eyes softened. "You still sing like someone who remembers." Neither of them spoke of the past directly, yet it hovered between them, palpable as the faint hum of the amplifiers cooling behind the stage. Finally, Clara broke the silence. "I'm married," she said. "A long time ago. 2 children. One's grown. The other's, well, she's still finding her way." But the marriage didn't last. She paused, a flicker of bitterness in her voice. "Seems most don't anymore." The comment was casual on the surface, but Elvis felt the tremor beneath it. Divorce was no longer scandalous by the 1970s. It had become almost ordinary. Yet hearing it from her carried weight. He thought of his own unraveling marriage, of the loneliness that clung to him even when surrounded by admirers. "I'm sorry," he said softly. Clara gave a short laugh, almost humorless. "Don't be. Life moves. People change." She hesitated, then added more quietly, "But sometimes I wondered what would have happened if I'd stayed that night, if I hadn't let the distance win." Her words stopped him cold. Elvis, who could fill any silence with a story, a joke, a song, said nothing. He only stared at her, eyes wide, lips parted as though speech itself had abandoned him. For years he had lived in a storm of noise, screaming fans, blaring speakers, headlines, but this quiet, this raw honesty, felt louder than all of it. The pause stretched until it was unbearable. Clara shifted slightly, as though ready to leave. That small movement jolted him back. He reached out, not to touch her, but to stop the moment from dissolving. "Tomorrow night," he said, his voice steadier now. "Come back. I want you there again. In the audience. The simplicity of the request startled her. She tilted her head, searching his face for some trace of the old boy she had known, the one who once strummed awkward chords under the Memphis stars. For a second, she saw him. Not the king, not the icon, but the boy. She didn't answer immediately. The backstage corridor around them buzzed with footsteps, laughter, the distant clatter of dishes from the kitchen. Yet, in the middle of it, they stood in a stillness that belonged only to them. Finally, Clara gave the faintest nod. "We'll see," she murmured. And with that, she turned to leave, the hem of her dress brushing against the dull carpet. Elvis watched her go, his chest tightening with something he hadn't felt in years. Not desire, not nostalgia alone, but the dizzying, terrifying sense that the past had walked back into his present, demanding to be acknowledged. When the door closed behind her, the noise of Vegas came rushing back. The call of dealers at the tables, the laughter of tourists, the commands of Colonel Parker already planning the next set list. But Elvis remained rooted in place, staring at the empty hallway where Clara had stood. For once, the applause of thousands felt hollow compared to the weight of a single woman's presence. The following evening, the Hilton showroom was alive again. A churn of sequins, tuxedos, clinking glasses, and whispered anticipation. Tourists crowded the aisles, gamblers ducked in between rounds at the tables, and the air carried that unmistakable Vegas cocktail of perfume, bourbon, and cigarette smoke. The orchestra warmed up, brass glinting under the spotlights, strings humming softly as waiters slipped between tables, with cocktails balanced on silver trays. Elvis lingered in the wings, cape folded over his shoulders, microphone warm in his hand. To most in the audience, tonight was another performance in an endless string of Vegas spectacles. But for him, it was a trial of sorts. He scanned the crowd from the shadows, searching. And there, not in the front row, where his most devoted fans leaned forward breathlessly, but farther back, half hidden among strangers, sat Clara. She hadn't chosen the spotlight. She wore a dark dress this time, simple, understated, as though trying to blur into the crowd. Yet to him, she glowed brighter than the stage lights. Elvis inhaled sharply, steadying himself, then strode out as the orchestra struck its opening chords. The audience erupted. Women screamed, men whistled, cameras flashed. Elvis launched into his opening numbers with familiar energy. C.C. Rider. Burning Love. His voice powerful, his movements sharp, his cape catching the light like wings. To the untrained eye, it was the same spectacle as always. But beneath the surface, something in him was different. By the middle of the set, he could feel the pull. His gaze kept drifting to where Clara sat, expression guarded, hands folded in her lap. She didn't cheer wildly like the others. She didn't swoon or reach forward. She simply listened, her eyes steady on him, and that steadiness unnerved him more than 1,000 screams. Halfway through the show, he broke script. He turned to the band, gave a small nod, and the opening notes of a song not on the program filled the hall. I Can't Stop Loving You. The orchestra faltered for a second. The musicians weren't expecting it. But Elvis pressed on, his voice rich and trembling. He sang not to the sea of strangers, but to one woman in the dimly lit row. Each line felt pulled from somewhere deep, a confession laid bare before an audience too dazzled to realize what it was witnessing. I can't stop wanting you. The room shifted. Conversations hushed, glasses stopped clinking, even the waiters slowed their pace. People felt it instinctively. Something unplanned was happening. The cameras, roving the audience for reaction shots, swept across faces until, for a brief second, they caught Clara. She looked startled, almost pained, as if the words had landed directly on her chest. The image flickered on the large monitors, and whispers rippled through the crowd. "The king sings for someone," murmured a woman at a nearby table. A man leaned closer to his companion. "Who is she?" No one had an answer. By the time Elvis reached the final verse, the audience was hushed in reverence. His voice, usually polished with showman's precision, cracked slightly on a note. Not out of weakness, but out of rawness. It was the sound of a man singing not as an entertainer, but as a soul confessing what words alone could never carry. The applause, when it ended, was thunderous, yet Elvis barely acknowledged it. He gave a quick bow, muttered thanks, and moved into the next number, though his eyes lingered once more in Clara's direction. She did not move. When the show concluded, fans surged toward the stage door, clutching programs and cameras, shouting his name. Journalists waited with pens ready, hoping for quotes, but Elvis sidestepped them all. "No press tonight," he told his aides curtly, waving off the usual post-show circus. His entourage knew better than to argue. He slipped out a side exit where his Cadillac idled, and there, waiting in the shadows of the neon glow, stood Clara. Not eager, not expectant, simply waiting. Elvis approached slowly, almost cautiously, as though afraid the image might vanish if he moved too quickly. "You came back," he said, his voice low, carrying relief he hadn't meant to reveal. "I wasn't sure I would," she admitted, "but I did." They stood in silence for a moment, the hum of the city filling the gap, the ringing of slot machines, the bark of dealers, the thrum of passing traffic. Finally, Elvis gestured toward the car. "Come ride with me," he said, "just for a while." Clara hesitated, then nodded. They slid into the Cadillac, the leather seats cool against the desert night. The driver pulled away, neon signs flashing across the windshield as they glided down the strip. Casinos rose on either side, Sahara, Stardust, Flamingo, each glowing with relentless brightness. But inside the car, it was quiet, insulated, as though they had slipped into a world of their own. Elvis leaned back, exhaling deeply. "It's strange," he said softly. "I sing for thousands, but it feels like the first time in years I was really singing tonight." Clara turned to him, her eyes reflecting the neon glow. "You were," she said simply, "but not for them." He laughed quietly, though it carried no humor. "No, not for them." The car turned onto a quieter street, away from the strip's chaos. Outside, the desert air pressed cool against the windows. Inside, the silence thickened again, filled with memories neither dared to speak aloud. Clara broke it first. "You've changed," she said. "So have you," he replied. They exchanged a look, part recognition, part sorrow, part something unspoken. The years had carved them into different people, yet in that moment, the past and present collided with a force neither could deny. The Cadillac rolled on through the Vegas night, carrying two people bound by something more enduring than fame, more fragile than memory, and more dangerous than either had expected. The Hilton suite was vast, but Elvis rarely noticed its luxury anymore. Gold-trimmed mirrors, thick carpets, velvet drapes, the excess blurred together after years of living in hotel rooms that never quite felt like home. Tonight, though, the room felt different. The air carried a stillness, almost fragile, as if the city's roar outside had been muted. Clara sat in one of the armchairs near the window, legs crossed neatly, her hands folded as if she needed something to anchor herself. Elvis poured 2 glasses of iced tea, his preference on nights when the weight of the show lingered too heavily for stronger drink. He handed her one, then lowered himself into the chair opposite her. For the first time since they'd seen each other again, there was no stage, no audience, no armor of performance. "You remember the corner store?" Clara asked suddenly, breaking the silence. He blinked, startled by the abruptness of the memory. "Which one?" "The one where you carried that battered guitar case like it was treasure. You looked so nervous, like you were afraid someone might laugh." A faint smile touched his lips. "I was afraid. Afraid of a lot of things. But you didn't laugh." She returned the smile, softer now. "I almost did. But I saw how much it mattered to you. And something in me, I don't know. I wanted you to keep carrying it." Elvis leaned back, eyes distant. "Funny thing is, I still carry it. Only now it weighs a whole lot more." For a long moment, they let the silence settle again. Outside, neon lights flickered, casting faint colors across the thick drapes. Somewhere below, the endless pulse of Las Vegas rolled on, the casinos, the laughter, the metallic clatter of coins. But here, in the suite, time seemed to have slowed. "I didn't come here for anything," Clara said at last. "Not for favors, not for stories. I just wanted to see who you'd become." Elvis's throat tightened. He had heard every kind of request from people. Money, jobs, introductions, photographs, but never that. "And what do you see?" he asked quietly. Clara studied him, her eyes unflinching. "A man who's given pieces of himself away until he doesn't know what's left." The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. Elvis looked down at his hands, the veins visible beneath the skin, fingers that had once strummed clumsy chords for her on a Memphis porch. Now those hands were insured, idolized, watched by millions. But they had never felt heavier. He sighed. "I stand on stage, and they think I've got the world. But most nights, when I walk off, it feels like I got nothing. Just noise that fades as soon as the lights go down." Clara nodded slowly, her expression softening. "I wondered if it was like that." Then, almost as if she had rehearsed it, she drew a breath and said, "I didn't come alone tonight." Elvis looked up sharply. "My daughter was with me," she continued. "She sat in another section. She's 14. I didn't want her close enough for the cameras, not in this city. But she wanted to see you, because she's known about you her whole life. She knows there was a boy in Memphis who once mattered to me." The words landed with the force of revelation. For a moment, Elvis couldn't move. Images raced through his mind. A child he'd never met, growing up while he'd been drowning in fame, singing to faceless crowds while missing the most ordinary moments of life. He felt his chest tighten with something that wasn't jealousy or regret exactly, but a piercing awareness of time. How much had passed? How much was already gone? "She looks like you," Clara added softly. "But she's got my stubbornness. And she listens to music like it's oxygen." I thought, maybe she should see you on stage once, to understand why people talk about you the way they do. Elvis pressed a hand against his forehead, overwhelmed. "I never thought I'd hear that from you," he murmured. "It doesn't mean what you think," Clara replied quickly. "She's not your responsibility. She's mine. But when she begged to come tonight, I realized maybe she needed to see not the legend, but the man who once made her mother believe anything was possible." Elvis lowered his hand, his eyes glistening in the dim light. "And what about you, Clara? Did you believe it was possible? All this?" He gestured vaguely at the ornate suite, the costumes hanging on racks, the endless stream of people who served his every move. Clara's gaze dropped. for a while, until it became too big. Bigger than us. Bigger than me. The room grew quiet again. The sound of the air conditioner hummed softly, filling the silence they didn't know how to break. Finally, Elvis leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You know what's strange? I thought tonight was just another show, another chance to prove I still had it. But when I saw you out there, it wasn't about them anymore. It was about remembering who I was before all this swallowed me." Clara's eyes glistened, though she didn't let tears fall. "Maybe that's why I came. To remind myself, too." For a while, they sat without speaking, two people bound by history, separated by decades, yet tethered still by something neither of them could quite name. Then Elvis whispered, almost to himself, "Maybe it's not the applause that matters. Maybe it's being seen, truly seen, even if it's just once in a lifetime." The words hung in the air, fragile and final. Clara didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her silence was acknowledgement enough. And in that silence, Elvis realized the truth he'd been running from. The past hadn't disappeared. It had simply been waiting, biding its time, until it stepped back into his life, carrying both memory and revelation in its hands. The next night, the Hilton showroom pulsed with the same restless energy as always. But for Elvis, the air felt charged with something new. He had asked, no, insisted, that Clara bring her daughter. It was a request, unlike him. He rarely blurred the fragile line between his stage life and whatever scraps of privacy remained. Yet the thought of the girl, sitting in the shadows the night before, unseen, tugged at him in a way he couldn't ignore. The room was packed. Gamblers with cigars still smoldering from the tables, women in sequined gowns, tourists snapping illicit photographs before security caught them. Waiters balanced silver trays, and the smell of bourbon and smoke curled under the heavy chandeliers. Behind the curtain, Elvis tightened his belt, adjusted the jeweled collar of his white jumpsuit, and exhaled slowly. His band waited for his cue. The colonel muttered about pacing, about the press outside, but Elvis barely heard him. When the lights dropped and the first blast of horns ripped through the air, the audience rose in a collective gasp. Elvis strode on stage, cape spreading like a bird of fire. The screams rolled over him in waves, but he scanned the crowd, eyes darting past the glitter and flash, until he saw them. Clara, seated farther back than before, her posture rigid, her hands gripping the edge of the table. And beside her, the girl. The daughter had her mother's profile, the same sharp line of chin, but her eyes, they were wide, luminous, full of nervous wonder. Elvis felt his chest tighten. She was young, on the edge of womanhood, with that same mix of defiance and uncertainty he remembered in Clara long ago. She looked at him not like a fan, not like the women who reached out their arms, but like someone encountering a living myth for the first time. The show rolled on. C.C. Ryder, Polk Salad Annie, the familiar hits. Elvis's voice filled the hall, powerful as ever, but he could feel his attention tilting, pulled toward the girl. At moments, he caught Clara's eyes as well, steady, unreadable, as if she were silently reminding him to tread carefully. Midway through, without warning, he changed the rhythm of the night. During Love Me Tender, as the band played softly, Elvis stepped down from the stage, microphone still in hand. The crowd erupted, women surged forward, security panicked. But Elvis moved past them, weaving through tables, ignoring the desperate hands reaching out. He walked until he stood directly in front of Clara and her daughter. The spotlight followed him, the entire audience now hushed in disbelief. Elvis crouched slightly, lowering the microphone. His gaze landed on the girl. She froze, cheeks flushing crimson, eyes wide with terror and delight. "Sing with me," he said gently, extending the microphone. The room seemed to stop breathing. The girl stammered, no sound escaping at first. Then she let out a small laugh. Nervous, unplanned, pure. The crowd erupted in warm applause, charmed by her innocence. Clara pressed a trembling hand to her lips, tears threatening to spill. Elvis smiled, the kind of smile that stripped away the rhinestones, the persona, the legend. For a fleeting second, he was simply a man coaxing courage from a child. The orchestra softened, waiting. Finally, the girl whispered a line, off-key, barely audible, and the audience melted into applause. Elvis sang the rest, his voice carrying her along, wrapping her in safety. The moment lasted less than a minute, but it felt eternal. Cameras flashed, journalists scribbled furiously. Already the whispers spread through the showroom. Who was the mystery girl the king had chosen? By the end of the song, Elvis handed the microphone back to the stagehand, but his gaze lingered on Clara. She was crying openly now, no longer able to hold back. He nodded to her, a small, almost invisible gesture that only she would understand. Back on stage, he launched into the final numbers with a surge of energy that startled even the band. He moved with ferocity, sang as though burning through years of exhaustion, the sweat pouring down his temples. To the crowd, it was Elvis in full command. But to Clara, it was something else. A man pouring himself into the only language he trusted, music, and offering it not to the masses, but to her, and to the girl who carried both of their histories. When the concert ended, the applause shook the walls. Fans shouted his name, begged for scarves, pleaded for encores. Elvis bowed deeply, cape flaring, but his last glance was not at the screaming thousands. It was at the corner of the room where Clara and her daughter sat, still rooted to their seats, stunned by what had just happened. Later, as the crowd spilled into the casino floors, the press raced to file their stories. By morning, headlines would read, "Elvis Presley sings to young girl in audience." Photographs would circulate. Speculation would mount. Some would say she was a contest winner. Others, a lucky fan. No one outside that small circle would know the truth. Backstage, when the chaos had quieted, Clara approached him. She said nothing at first. Then, softly, she spoke the name she had not used in decades. L. The sound of it struck him harder than the roar of any arena. He turned, eyes glistening, and for a brief moment he felt the years fall away. He was 19 again, standing outside a corner store with a guitar case too heavy for his shoulders. Only now he was carrying something much heavier still. The Hilton suite had seen countless late nights. Poker games with his entourage, impromptu jam sessions, dinners brought up at odd hours. But this night was unlike any other. There were no reporters waiting outside, no dealers in the corner, no hangers-on filling the couches. Just 3 people, gathered around a low table where a silver pot of tea steamed quietly. Elvis sat in his usual armchair, shoulders slouched, cape folded on the backrest, like the discarded shell of a creature too heavy to carry. Across from him, Clara rested on the sofa, posture composed but eyes betraying exhaustion. Between them, her daughter perched on the edge of a chair, her legs crossed nervously, glancing between the 2 adults as if she were intruding on something private, yet sacred. For a while, no one spoke. The clinking of porcelain teacups and the faint hum of the city outside filled the silence. Then Elvis broke it, his voice low, stripped of performance. "You know," he said, staring at the tea he hadn't touched, People think I live in a dream, that every night is glory. But most nights, when the curtain falls, I feel more empty than full. Clara watched him carefully. She had seen him command thousands with a single gesture, had seen the way the crowd bent to his every move. Yet here was a man confessing loneliness, like it was a wound. Her daughter tilted her head. "But you looked happy on stage," she said softly. Elvis smiled faintly, not at her words, but at her innocence. "On stage, I can be anything. For those 2 hours, I'm alive in a way nothing else gives me. But when the lights go down," he shrugged, "it's quiet again. Too quiet." The girl studied him. She had been raised on stories of his music, of the boy her mother once knew, but this was different. This was no legend, no magazine cover. This was a man weary of being more symbol than flesh. Clara leaned forward. "Are you happy, Elle?" she asked, her voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. The question hung there, heavy. Elvis looked at her, then at the girl, then back down at his hands. The silence stretched until it seemed unbearable. Finally, he spoke. "Sometimes," he admitted. "On stage. In the music. But outside of that? Rarely." The words weren't bitter. They were honest, unadorned, as though admitting them lifted a burden. The girl, emboldened, leaned in. "I think I understand why Mama still talks about you," she said. "When you sing, you're not pretending. You're alive." That's what I saw tonight. Elvis felt something tighten in his chest. Of all the praise he had received, from critics, from fans, from presidents even, nothing pierced him like this. From the mouth of a teenager. Not adoration, but recognition. Clara's eyes shone, but she held them steady. "That's what I saw, too." Long ago, the air between them thickened with memory, with the unspoken truth that they had been part of each other's stories long before the world demanded Elvis belong to everyone. The moment was broken by a knock at the door. One of the managers stepped in, clipboard in hand, face tense. "Elvis, you've got the press waiting. They want a statement about tonight's show. Tomorrow's schedule." "Not now," Elvis cut him off sharply. His voice, usually velvet even in irritation, carried steel this time. The man hesitated, glanced at Clara and her daughter, then withdrew quickly. The door shut, leaving the three of them in silence once more. Elvis exhaled, running a hand through his damp hair. "That's the thing. I don't own my hours anymore. Every minute belongs to someone else. A manager, a fan, a photographer. I don't even know which minutes are mine." Clara reached across the table not to touch him, but to bridge the space with her presence. "You're still you, somewhere inside all that. I saw it tonight." He looked at her, eyes searching. "Did you? Or did you see the man they've built out of me?" Clara shook her head firmly. "I saw the boy from Memphis. Just older, tired maybe, but still him." The girl shifted in her chair, her voice quiet but steady. "Maybe you're both. Maybe you're theirs on stage, but ours here." For now, the words struck him harder than he expected. He stared at her, then at Clara, then back again. For a moment, he allowed himself the impossible thought that this tiny bubble of honesty, away from the stage lights, was what he had been chasing all along. "Maybe I was never meant to belong to one person," he said at last, his voice heavy with both resignation and wonder. "Maybe I was meant to belong to everyone, and no one at all." The sentence lingered in the air, echoing like the final note of a ballad. Clara's eyes glistened, though she blinked back the tears. Her daughter sat still, absorbing the weight of words she might not fully understand, yet would never forget. The suite returned to silence, the city outside still roaring, indifferent. But inside that room, 3 lives had crossed in a way none of them had planned, in a conversation that was never meant to happen, and could never happen again. The following night, the Hilton showroom felt heavier, as if the air itself carried the memory of what had already happened. The orchestra tuned, the spotlights flickered, waiters hurried through the aisles. To most in the audience, this was another chance to witness the king of rock and roll. To Elvis, it felt like standing on the edge of something final, though he couldn't explain why. He walked onto the stage in a white suit, embroidered with golden threads, cape flowing behind him. The crowd exploded in cheers, cameras flashed, and voices cried his name as though they were summoning a deity. Yet in the middle of that storm he spotted Clara, seated not near the front this time, but in a dim corner of the hall. Beside her sat her daughter, wide-eyed and solemn. They did not wave, did not call out. They simply watched. The first half of the show unfolded as always. Thunderous, electric, precise. Elvis moved with the practiced energy of a man who knew his body's limits but refused to obey them. Suspicious minds brought the audience to their feet. Scarves were tossed into eager hands. The band followed his every shift with military precision. But beneath the showmanship, something was different. His voice carried a deeper weight, each lyric pressed with urgency, as though he knew this night mattered more than the rest. Then came the moment. The orchestra struck the familiar chords of Can't Help Falling in Love. The hall hushed. It was the anthem of his shows, the closing benediction. But instead of the smooth, familiar tempo, Elvis slowed it, bending the rhythm into something more intimate. His voice, lower and rougher than usual, wrapped around the lines like a private message disguised as a song. Take my hand. Take my whole life, too. He wasn't looking at the thousands swaying in unison. His eyes were locked on that corner of the hall. Clara's face was half hidden by shadow, but he could see the shimmer of tears. Her daughter clutched her mother's hand, trembling with the knowledge that something larger than performance was unfolding before her. The band glanced at each other, confused by the sudden shift, but they followed him faithfully, softening their playing to give his voice room. The audience, sensing the change, grew still. For the first time that night, no one screamed, no one reached out. They simply listened. By the time the final note faded, the silence was absolute. Then, slowly, the applause began, rising, swelling, shaking the chandeliers. Elvis bowed deeply, cape flaring, sweat dripping down his temples. Normally he would say his famous line, "Thank you very much." But tonight he paused. He scanned the crowd one last time, his gaze lingering on Clara and her daughter. Then he spoke words no one expected. Take care of each other. That's all that matters. It was simple, almost offhand. Yet in that moment, it carried the weight of a farewell. The crowd erupted again, but to Clara it felt less like triumph and more like an ending. When the curtain fell, Elvis disappeared into the labyrinth of backstage corridors. His entourage swarmed, congratulating him, offering drinks, asking for directions about tomorrow's schedule. But he brushed past them all and retreated to his dressing room. Inside, the noise of the world fell away. The room smelled faintly of powder and sweat, the lights above the mirror buzzing softly. Elvis sank into the chair, his cape sliding to the floor. He stared at his reflection, the painted-on eyeliner, the glistening skin, the rhinestones catching the fluorescent glow. For a long time, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he smiled. Not the wide grin for cameras, not the charming smirk for fans, but a small, weary smile, because he knew something few others did. Sometimes a single encounter could outweigh decades of noise. Clara's face in the crowd, the girl's laugh when he lowered the microphone. These were not headlines, not contracts, not trophies. They were reminders that he had once been seen, truly seen, beyond the costume, beyond the myth. Downstairs, the casino roared on. Coins clattered into trays, dice rolled across felt tables, neon lights pulsed without pause. But in the quiet of that dressing room, Elvis sat alone, savoring a silence that felt strangely full. Clara would leave the city the next morning. He would never see her again. Yet the memory of her presence, steady, unshaken by fame, would linger like the aftertaste of a song that refused to fade. For the rest of the world, it was just another Vegas show. But for him, it was something else. A night when applause gave way to truth, when the king let slip the crown for a moment and simply became Elvis, a man who once loved and lost, and who carried that love into every note until the end.